So yes, this is St. John's Eve by Nikolai Gogol. Toma Grigorovich had one very strange eccentricity. To the day of his death, he never liked to tell the same thing twice. There were times when, if you asked him to relate a thing afresh, he would interpolate new matter, or alter it so that it was impossible to recognize it. Once upon a time, one of those gentlemen who like every sort of frippery and issue mean little volumes no thicker than an ABC book every month or even every week, wormed this same story out of Toma Grigorovich, and the latter completely forgot about it. But that same young gentleman in the pea-green kaftan came from Poltava, bringing with him a little book, and, opening it in the middle, showed it to us. Toma Grigorovich was on the point of setting his spectacles astride of his nose, but recollected that he had forgotten to wind thread about them and stick them together with wax, so he passed it over to me. As I understand something about reading and writing, and do not wear spectacles, I undertook to read it. I had not turned 2 leaves when all at once he caught me by the hand and stopped me. "Stop! Tell me first what you are reading." I confess that I was a trifle stunned by such a question. "What? What am I reading, Toma Grigorovich?" "Why, your own words." "Who told you that they were my words?" "Why, what more would you have? Here it is, printed, related by such and such a sacristan." "Spit on the head of the man who printed that. He lies, the dog of a Moscow peddler. Did I say that? 'Twas just the same as though one hadn't his wits about him. Listen, I'll tell the tale to you on the spot." We moved up the table, and he began. "My grandfather, the kingdom of heaven be his, may he eat only wheaten rolls and poppy seed cakes with honey in the other world, could tell a story wonderfully well. When he used to begin a tale, you could not stir from the spot all day, but kept on listening. He was not like the storyteller of the present day, when he begins to lie, with a tongue as though he had had nothing to eat for 3 days, so that you snatch your cap and flee from the house. I remember my old mother was alive then, and in the long winter evenings when the frost was crackling out of doors and had sealed up hermetically the narrow panes of our cottage, she used to sit at her wheel, drawing out a long thread in her hand, rocking the cradle with her foot, and humming a song, which I seem to hear even now. The lamp, quivering and flaring up as though in fear of something, lighted up our cottage. The spindle hummed, and all of us children, collected in a cluster, listened to our grandfather, who had not crawled off the stove for more than 5 years, owing to his great age. But the wondrous tales of the incursions of the Zaporozhian Cossacks and the Poles, the bold deeds of Polkova, of Poltar-Kozuk, and Sagaitajny, did not interest us so much as the stories about some deed of old, which always sent a shiver through our frames and made our hair rise upright on our heads. Sometimes such terror took possession of us in consequence of them, that, from that evening forward, heaven knows how wonderful everything seemed to us. If one chanced to go out of the cottage after nightfall for anything, one fancied that a visitor from the other world had lain down to sleep in one's bed, and I have often taken my own smock, at a distance, as it lay at the head of the bed, for the evil one rolled up in a ball. But the chief thing about grandfather's stories was that he had never lied in all his life, and whatever he said so was so. I will now tell you one of his wonderful tales. I know that there are a great many wise people who copy in the courts and can even read civil documents, but who, if you were to put into their hand a simple prayer book, could not make out the first letter in it, and would show all their teeth in derision. These people laugh at everything you tell them. Along comes one of them, and doesn't believe in witches. Yes, glory to God that I have lived so long in the world. I have seen heretics to whom it would be easier to lie in confession than it would be to our brothers and equals to take snuff, and these folk would deny the existence of witches? But let them just dream about something, and they won't even tell what it was. There, it is no use talking about them. No one could have recognised the village of ours, a little over 100 years ago. It was a hamlet, the poorest kind of a hamlet. 60 of miserable farmhouses, unplastered and badly thatched, were scattered here and there about the fields. There was not a yard or a decent shed to shelter animals or wagons. That was the way the wealthy lived, and if you had looked about for our brothers, the poor, why, a hole in the ground, that was a cabin for you. Only by the smoke could you tell that a God-created man lived there. You ask why they lived so? It was not entirely through poverty. Almost everyone led a raiding Cossack life, and gathered not a little plunder in foreign lands. It was rather because it was little use building up a good wooden house. Many folk were engaged in raids all over the country, Crimeans, Poles, Lithuanians. It was quite possible that their own countrymen might make a descent and plunder everything. Anything was possible. In this hamlet, a man, or rather a devil in human form, often made his appearance. Why he came, and whence, no one knew. He prowled about, got drunk, and suddenly disappeared as if into the air, leaving no trace of his existence. Then, behold, he seemed to have dropped from the sky again, and went flying about the street of the village, of which no trace now remains, and which was not more than 100 paces from Dikanka. He would collect together all the Cossacks he met. Then there were songs, laughter, and cash in plenty, and vodka flowed like water. He would address the pretty girls, and give them ribbons, earrings, strings of beads, more than they knew what to do with. It is true that the pretty girls rather hesitated about accepting his presents. God knows, perhaps, what unclean hands they had passed through. My grandfather's aunt, who kept at that time a tavern, in which Basavruk, as they called this devil-man, often caroused, said that no consideration on the earth would have induced her to accept a gift from him. But then again, how avoid accepting? Fear seized on everyone when he knit his shaggy brows and gave a sidelong glance which might send your feet God knows whither, whilst if you did accept, then the next night some fiend from the swamp, with horns on his head, came and began to squeeze your neck, if there was a string of beads upon it, or bite your finger if there was a ring upon it, or drag you by the hair if ribbons were braided in it. God have mercy, then, on those who held such gifts. But there was the difficulty. It was impossible to get rid of them. If you threw them into the water, the diabolical ring or necklace would skim along the surface and into your hand. There was a church in the village, St. Pantelei, if I remember rightly. There lived there a priest, Father Anthasai, of blessed memory. Observing that Basavruk did not come to church even at Easter, he determined to reprove him and impose penance on him. Well, he hardly escaped with his life. "Hark ye, sir," he thundered in reply, "learn to mind your own business instead of meddling in other people's if you don't want that throat of yours stuck together with boiling kutya." What was to be done with this unrepentant man? Father Athansai consented himself with announcing that anyone who should make the acquaintance of Basavruk would be counted as a Catholic, an enemy of Christ's Orthodox Church, not a member of the human race. In this village there was a Cossack named Korsh, who had a labourer whom people called Peter the Orphan, perhaps because no one remembered either his father or his mother. The church elder, it is true, said that they had died of the pest in his 2nd year, but my grandfather's aunt would not hear of that, and tried with all her might to furnish him with parents, although poor Peter needed them about as much as we need last year's snow. She said that his father had been in Zaporozhye, and had been taken prisoner by the Turks, amongst whom he underwent God only knows what tortures, until, having by some miracle disguised himself as a eunuch, he made his escape. Little cared the black-browed youths and maidens about Peter's parents. They merely remarked that if he only had a new coat, a red sash, a black lambskin cap with a smart blue crown on his head, a Turkish sabre by his side, a whip in one hand and a pipe with handsome mountings in the other, he would surpass all the young men. but the pity was that the only thing poor Peter had was a grey gabardine with more holes in it than there are gold pieces. But that was not the worst of it. Korsh had a daughter, such a beauty as I think you can hardly have chanced to see. My grandfather's aunt used to say, and you know that it is easier for a woman to kiss the evil one than to call anyone else a beauty, that this Cossack maiden's cheeks were as plump and fresh as the pinkest poppy. When bathed in God's dew, it unfolds its petals and coquettes with the rising sun, that her brows were evenly arched over her bright eyes like black cords, such as our maidens buy nowadays for their crosses and ducats off the Moscow peddlers who visit the villages with their baskets, that her little mouth, at sight of which the youths smacked their lips, seemed made to warble the songs of nightingales, that her hair, black as the raven's wing and soft as young flax, fell in curls over her shoulders. For our maidens did not then plait their hair in pigtails interwoven with pretty, bright-hued ribbons. May I never intone another Alleluia in the choir, if I would not have kissed her, in spite of the grey which is making its way through the old wool which covers my pate, and of the old woman beside me, like a thorn in my side. Well, you know what happens when young men and maidens live side by side. In the twilight, the heels of red boots were always visible in the place where Pidorka chatted with her Peter. But Korsh would never have suspected anything out of the way. Only one day, it is evident that none but the evil one could have inspired him, Peter took it into his head to kiss the maiden's rosy lips with all his heart, without first looking well about him. And that same evil one, may the son of a dog dream of the Holy Cross, caused the old greybeard, like a fool, to open the cottage door at that moment. Korsh was petrified, dropped his jaw, and clutched at the door for support. Those unlucky kisses completely stunned him. Recovering himself, he took his grandfather's hunting whip from the wall and was about to belabour Peter's back with it, when Pidorka's little 6-year-old brother Ivas rushed up from somewhere or other, and grasping his father's legs with his little hands, screamed out, "Daddy, Daddy, don't beat Peter!" What was to be done? A father's heart is not made of stone. Hanging the whip again upon the wall, he led Peter quietly from the house. "If you ever show yourself in my cottage again, or even under the windows, look out, Peter, for by heaven your black moustache will disappear, and your black locks, though wound twice about your ears, will take leave of your pate, or my name is not Terenti Korsh." So saying, he gave him such a taste of his fist in the nape of his neck that all grew dark before Peter, and he flew headlong out of the place. So there was an end of their kissing. Sorrow fell upon our turtle doves, and a rumour grew rife in the village that a certain Pole, all embroidered with gold, with moustaches, sabre, spurs, and pockets jingling like the bells of the bag with which our sacristan Taras goes through the church every day, had begun to frequent Korsh's house. Now it is well known why a father has visitors when there is a black-browed daughter about. So one day Pidorka burst into tears and caught the hand of her brother Ivas. "Ivas, my dear, Ivas, my love, fly to Peter, my child of gold, like an arrow from a bow. Tell him all. I would have loved his brown eyes, I would have kissed his fair face, but my fate decrees otherwise. More than one handkerchief have I wet with burning tears. I am sad and heavy at heart, and my own father is my enemy. I will not marry the Pole, whom I do not love. Tell him they are making ready for a wedding, but there will be no music at our wedding. Priests will sing instead of pipes and viols. I shall not dance with my bridegroom. They will carry me out. Dark, dark will be my dwelling of maple wood, and instead of chimneys, a cross will stand upon the roof." Peter stood petrified, without moving from the spot, when the innocent child lisped out Pidorka's words to him. "And I, wretched man, had thought to go to the Crimea and Turkey to win gold and return to thee, my beauty. But it may not be. We have been overlooked by the evil eye. I too shall have a wedding, dear one, but no ecclesiastics will be present at that wedding. The black crow instead of the Pope will caw over me. The bare plain will be my dwelling, the dark blue cloud my roof tree. The eagle will claw out my brown eyes, the rain will wash my Cossack bones, and the whirlwinds will dry them. But what am I? Of what should I complain? 'Tis clear God willed it so. If I am to be lost, then so be it. And he went straight up to the tavern. My late grandfather's aunt was somewhat surprised at seeing Peter at the tavern, at an hour when good men go to morning mass, and stared at him as though in a dream when he called for a jug of brandy, about half a pailful. But the poor fellow tried in vain to drown his woe. The vodka stung his tongue like nettles, and tasted more bitter than wormwood. He flung the jug from him upon the ground. "You have sorrowed enough, Cossack," growled a bass voice behind him. He looked round. It was Basavriuk. Ugh, what a face! His hair was like a brush, his eyes like those of a bull. "I know what you lack. Here it is." As he spoke, he jingled a leather purse which hung from his girdle and smiled diabolically. Peter shuddered. "Ah ha! How it shines!" he roared, shaking out ducats into his hands. "How it jingles! And I only ask one thing for a whole pile of such shiners." "It is the evil one!" exclaimed Peter. "Give me them! I'm ready for anything." They struck hands upon it, and Basavriuk said, "You are just in time, Peter. Tomorrow is St. John the Baptist's day. Only on this one night in the year does the fern blossom. I will await you at midnight in the Bear's Ravine." I do not believe that chickens await the hour when the housewife brings their corn with as much anxiety as Peter awaited the evening. He kept looking to see whether the shadows of the trees were not lengthening, whether the sun was not turning red towards setting, and the longer he watched, the more impatient he grew. How long it was! Evidently God's day had lost its end somewhere. But now the sun has set. The sky is red only on one side, and it is already growing dark. It grows colder in the fields. It gets gloomier and gloomier, and at last quite dark. At last. With heart almost bursting from his bosom, he set out and cautiously made his way down through the thick woods into the deep hollow called the Bear's Ravine. Basavriuk was already waiting there. It was so dark that you could not see a yard before you. Hand in hand they entered the ravine, pushing through the luxuriant thorn bushes and stumbling at almost every step. At last they reached an open spot. Peter looked about him. He had never chanced to come there before. Here Basavriuk halted. "Do you see before you 3 hillocks? There are a great many kinds of flowers upon them. May some power keep you from plucking even one of them. But as soon as the fern blossoms, seize it and look not round, no matter what may seem to be going on behind thee." Peter wanted to ask some questions, but, behold, Basavriuk was no longer there. He approached the 3 hillocks. Where were the flowers? He saw none. The wild steppe grass grew all around, and hid everything in its luxuriance. But the lightning flashed, and before him was a whole bed of flowers, all wonderful, all strange, whilst among them there were also the simple fronds of fern. Peter doubted his senses, and stood thoughtfully before them, arms akimbo. What manner of prodigy is this? Why, one can see these weeds 10 times a day. What is there marvellous about them? Devil's face must be mocking me. But behold, the tiny flower bud of the fern reddened and moved as though alive. It was a marvel, in truth. It grew larger and glowed like a burning coal. The tiny stars of light flashed up, something burst softly, and the flower opened before his eyes like a flame, lighting the others about it. Now is the time, thought Peter, and extended his hand. He saw hundreds of hairy hands reach also for the flower from behind him, and there was a sound of scampering in the rear. He half closed his eyes, he plucked sharply at the stalk, and the flower remained in his hand. All became still. Upon a stump sat Basavriuk, quite blue like a corpse. He did not move so much as a finger. His eyes were immovably fixed on something visible to him alone. His mouth was half open and speechless. Nothing stirred around. Ugh, it was horrible. But then a whistle was heard, which made Peter's heart grow cold within him, and it seemed to him that the grass whispered, and the flowers began to talk among themselves in delicate voices, like little silver bells, whilst the trees rustled in murmuring contention. Basavriuk's face suddenly became full of life, and his eyes sparkled. "The witch has just returned," he muttered between his teeth. "Hearken, Peter, a charmer will stand before you in a moment. Do whatever she commands. If not, you are lost forever." Then he parted the thorn bushes with a knotty stick, and before him stood a tiny farmhouse. Basavriuk smote it with his fist, and the wall trembled. A large black dog ran out to meet them, and with a whine transformed itself into a cat and flew straight at his eyes. Don't be angry, you old Satan," said Basavriuk, employing such words as would have made a good man stop his ears. Behold, instead of a cat, an old woman all bent into a bow, with a face wrinkled like a baked apple, and a nose and chin like a pair of nutcrackers. A fine charmer, thought Peter, and cold chills ran down his back. The witch tore the flower from his hand, stooped and muttered over it for a long time, sprinkling it with some kind of water. Sparks flew from her mouth, and foam appeared on her lips. "Throw it away," she said, giving it back to Peter. Peter threw it, but what wonder was this? The flower did not fall straight to the earth, but for a long while twinkled like a fiery ball through the darkness, and swam through the air like a boat. At last it began to sink lower and lower, and fell so far away that the little star, hardly larger than a poppy seed, was barely visible. "There!" croaked the old woman in a dull voice, and Basavriuk, giving him a spade, said, "Dig here, Peter. You will find more gold than you or Korsh ever dreamed of." Peter spat on his hands, seized the spade, pressed his foot on it, and turned up the earth, a second, a third, a fourth time. The spade clinked against something hard, and would go no further. Then his eyes began to distinguish a small, iron-bound coffer. He tried to seize it, but the chest began to sink into the earth, deeper, farther, and deeper still, whilst behind him he heard a laugh like a serpent's hiss. "No, you shall not have the gold until you shed human blood," said the witch, and she led up to him a child of 6, covered with a white sheet, and indicated by a sign that he was to cut off his head. Peter was stunned. A trifle indeed to cut off a man's, or even an innocent child's, head for no reason whatever. In wrath he tore off the sheet enveloping the victim's head, and behold, before him stood Ivas. The poor child crossed his little hands and hung his head. Peter flew at the witch with the knife like a madman, and was on the point of laying hands on her. "What did you promise for the girl?" thundered Basavriuk, and like a shot he was on his back. The witch stamped her foot. A blue flame flashed from the earth and illumined all within it. The earth became transparent, as if moulded of crystal, and all that was within it became visible as if in the palm of the hand. Ducats, precious stones, in chests and pots, were piled in heaps beneath the very spot they stood on. Peter's eyes flashed, his mind grew troubled. He grasped the knife like a madman, and the innocent blood spurted into his eyes. Diabolical laughter resounded on all sides. Misshapen monsters flew past him in flocks. The witch, fastening her hands in the headless trunk like a wolf, drank its blood. His head whirled. Collecting all his strength, he set out to run. Everything grew red before him. The trees seemed steeped in blood and burned and groaned. The sky glowed and threatened. Burning points like lightning flickered before his eyes. Utterly exhausted, he rushed into his miserable hovel and fell to the ground like a log. A death-like sleep overpowered him. 2 days and 2 nights did Peter sleep, without once awakening. When he came to himself on the 3rd day, he looked long at all the corners of his hut, but in vain did he endeavour to recollect what had taken place. His memory was like a miser's pocket, from which you cannot entice a quarter of a kopeck. Stretching himself, he heard something clash at his feet. He looked. There were 2 bags of gold. Then only, as if in a dream, he recollected that he had been seeking for treasure, and that something had frightened him in the woods. But at what price he had obtained it, and how, he could by no means tell. Korsh saw the sacks, and was mollified. "A fine fellow, Peter, quite unequalled. Yes, and did I not love him? Was he not to me as my own son?" And the old man repeated this fiction until he wept over it himself. Pidorka began to tell Peter how some passing gypsies had stolen Ivas, but he could not even recall him. To such a degree had the devil's influence darkened his mind. There was no reason for delay. The poll was dismissed and the wedding feast prepared. Rolls were baked, towels and handkerchiefs embroidered. The young people were seated at table, and the wedding loaf was cut. Guitars, cymbals, pipes, viols sounded, and pleasure was rife. A wedding in the olden times was not like one of the present day. My grandfather's aunt used to tell how the maidens, in festive headdresses of yellow, blue, and pink ribbons, above which they bound gold braid, in thin chemisettes embroidered on all the seams with red silk, and strewn with tiny silver flowers, in Moroccan shoes with high iron heels, danced the Golitza as swimmingly as peacocks, and as wildly as the whirlwind. How the youths, with their ship-shaped caps upon their heads, the crowns of gold brocade, and 2 horns projecting, one in front and another behind, of the very finest black lambskin, in tunics of the finest blue silk with red borders, stepped forward one by one, their arms akimbo in stately form, and executed the gopak. How the lads, in tall Cossack caps and light cloth gabardines, girt with silver embroidered belts, their short pipes in their teeth, skipped before them and talked nonsense. Even Korsh, as he gazed at the young people, could not help getting gay in his old age. Guitar in hand, alternately puffing at his pipe and singing, a brandy glass upon his head, the grey beard began the national dance amid loud shouts from the merrymakers. All upon them glowed like a conflagration, and then they began to joke and play pranks. An amusing thing happened to my grandfather's aunt, who was at the wedding. She was wearing an ample Tartar robe, and, wine-glass in hand, was entertaining the company. The evil one instigated one man to pour vodka over her from behind. Another, at the same moment, evidently not by accident, struck a light and held it to her. The flame flashed up, and poor aunt, in terror, flung her dress off, before them all. Screams, laughter, jests arose as if at a fair. In a word, the old folks could not recall so merry a wedding. Pidorka and Peter began to live like a gentleman and a lady. There was plenty of everything, and everything was fine, but honest folk shook their heads when they marked their way of living. From the devil no good can come, they unanimously agreed. Whence, except from the tempter of orthodox people, came this wealth? Where else could he have got such a lot of gold? Why, on the very day that he got rich, did Basavriuk vanish as if into thin air? Say, if you can, that people only imagine things. A month had not passed, and no one would have recognized Peter. He sat in one spot, saying no word to anyone, but continually thinking and seemingly trying to recall something. When Pidorka succeeded in getting him to speak, he appeared to forget himself, and would carry on a conversation, and even grow cheerful. But if he inadvertently glanced at the sacks, "Stop, stop, I have forgotten!" he would cry, and again plunge into reverie and strive to recall something. Sometimes when he sat still a long time in one place, it seemed to him as though it were just coming back to mind, but then again all would fade away. It seemed as if he was sitting in the tavern. They brought him vodka. Vodka stung him. Vodka was repulsive to him. Someone came along and struck him on the shoulder, but beyond that everything was veiled in darkness before him. The perspiration would stream down his face, and he would sit exhausted in the same place. What did not Pidorka do? She consulted the sorceresses, and they poured out fear and brewed stomachache, but all to no avail. And so the summer passed. Many a Cossack had mowed and reaped. Many a Cossack, more enterprising than the rest, had set off upon an expedition. Flocks of ducks were already crowding the marshes, but there was not even a hint of improvement. It was red upon the steppes. Ricks of grain, like Cossacks' caps, dotted the fields here and there. On the highway were to be encountered wagons loaded with brushwood and logs. The ground had become more solid, and in places was touched with frost. Already had the snow begun to fall, and the branches of the trees were covered with rime like rabbit skin. Already on frosty days the robin redbreast hopped about on the snow heaps like a foppish Polish nobleman, and picked out grains of corn, and children with huge sticks played hockey upon the ice, while their fathers lay quietly on the stove, issuing forth at intervals with lighted pipes in their lips, to growl in regular fashion at the orthodox frost, or to take the air and thresh the grains spread out in the barn. At last the snow began to melt, and the ice slipped away, but Peter remained the same, and the more time went on, the more morose he grew. He sat in the cottage as though nailed to the spot, with the sacks of gold at his feet. He grew averse to look at Pidorka, and still thought of but one thing. Still he tried to recall something, and grew angry and ill-tempered because he could not. Often, rising wildly from his seat, he gesticulated violently and fixed his eyes on something as though desirous of catching it. His lips moved as though desirous of uttering some long-forgotten word, but remained speechless. Fury would take possession of him. He would gnaw and bite his hands like a man half crazy, and in his vexation would tear out his hair by the handful, until, calming down, he would relapse into forgetfulness, as it were, and then would again strive to recall the past and be again seized with fury and fresh tortures. Pidorka was neither dead nor alive. At first it was horrible to her to remain alone with him in the cottage, but in the course of time the poor woman grew accustomed to her sorrow. But it was impossible to recognize the Pidorka of former days. No blushes, no smiles. She was thin and worn with grief, and had wept her bright eyes away. Once someone who took pity on her advised her to go to the witch who dwelt in the Bear's Ravine, and enjoyed the reputation of being able to cure every disease in the world. She determined to try this last remedy, and finally persuaded the old woman to come to her. This was on St. John's Eve, as it chanced. Peter lay insensible on the bench, and did not observe the newcomer. Slowly he rose, and looked about him. Suddenly he trembled in every limb, as though he were on the scaffold. His hair rose upon his head, and he laughed a laugh that thrilled Pidorka's heart with fear. "I have remembered! Remembered!" he cried in terrible joy, and, swinging a hatchet round his head, he struck at the old woman with all his might. The hatchet penetrated the oaken door nearly 4 inches. The old woman disappeared, and a child of 7, covered in a white sheet, stood in the middle of the cottage. The sheet flew off. "Ivas!" cried Pidorka, and ran to him, but the apparition became covered from head to foot with blood and illumined the whole room with red light. She ran into the passage in her terror, but on recovering herself a little, wished to help Peter. In vain. The door had slammed to behind her so that she could not open it. People ran up and began to knock. They broke in the door, as though there were but one mind among them. The whole cottage was full of smoke, and just in the middle, where Peter had stood, was a heap of ashes from whence smoke was still rising. They flung themselves upon the sacks. Only broken potsherds lay there instead of ducats. The Cossacks stood with staring eyes and open mouths, as if rooted to the earth, not daring to move a hair. Such terror did this wonder inspire in them. I do not remember what happened next. Pidorka made a vow to go upon a pilgrimage, collected the property left her by her father, and in a few days it was as if she had never been in the village. Whither she had gone, no one could tell. Officious old women would have dispatched her to the same place whither Peter had gone, but a Cossack from Kiev reported that he had seen, in a cloister, a nun withered to a mere skeleton who prayed unceasingly. Her fellow villagers recognized her as Pidorka by the tokens, that no one heard her utter a word, and that she had come on foot and had brought a frame for the picture of God's mother, set with such brilliant stones that all were dazzled by the sight. But this was not the end, if you please. On the same day that the evil one made away with Peter, Basavriuk appeared again, but all fled from him. They knew what a sort of being he was, none else than Satan himself, who had assumed human form in order to unearth treasures, and since treasures do not yield to unclean hands, he seduced the young. That same year all deserted their earthen huts and collected in a village, but even there was no peace on account of that accursed Basavriuk. My late grandfather's aunt said that he was particularly angry with her because she had abandoned her former tavern, and tried with all his might to revenge himself upon her. Once the village elders were assembled in the tavern, and, as the saying goes, were arranging the precedents at the table, in the middle of which was placed a small roasted lamb, shame to say. They chatted about this, that and the other, among the rest about various marvels and strange things. Well, they saw something. It would have been nothing if only one had seen it, but all saw it. And it was this. The sheep raised his head. His goggling eyes became alive and sparkled, and the black bristling moustache, which appeared for one instant, made a significant gesture at those present. All at once recognized Basavriuk's countenance in the sheep's head. My grandfather's aunt thought it was on the point of asking her for vodka. The worthy elders seized their hats and hastened home. Another time, the church elder himself, who was fond of an occasional private interview with my grandfather's brandy glass, had not succeeded in getting to the bottom twice, when he beheld the glass bowing very low to him. "Satan take you! Let us make the sign of the cross over you!" And the same marvel happened to his better half. She had just begun to mix the dough in a huge kneading trough, when suddenly the trough sprang up. "Stop! Stop! Where are you going?" Putting its arms akimbo, with dignity, it went skipping all about the cottage. You may laugh, but this was no laughing matter to our grandfathers. And in vain did Father Athanasi go through the village with holy water and chase the devil through all the streets with his brush. My late grandfather's aunt long complained that, as soon as it was dark, someone came knocking at her door and scratching at the wall. Well, all appears to be quiet now in the place where our village stands, but it was not so very long ago, my father was still alive, that I remember how a good man could not pass the ruined tavern which a dishonest race had long managed for their own interest. From the smoke-blackened chimneys smoke poured out in a pillar, and rising high in the air, rolled off like a cap, scattering burning coals over the steppe. And Satan sobbed so pitifully in his lair that the startled ravens rose in flocks from the neighbouring oak wood and flew through the air with wild cries. Oh, I feel like there might be a little bit there lost in translation. There are some of the translations here that are very sort of matter of fact, but that one isn't, which is nice. But yeah, gives me very sort of Baba Yaga vibes. And there's a film about like a possessed sheep. I can't remember what it's called. But for some reason, not for some reason, the possessed sheep made me think of that. But yes, that was an interesting one, that. I guess don't Rollins come here in a close shave. Yep. Possessed sheep. He's called Sean, give him a name. Yeah, I guess don't make deals with the devil. A.C. Anderson is translated. I think there actually might be one in this. There's... Oh, I'm not reading an Icelandic one. I'm absolutely going to murder that. Yes, there's a Hans Christian Andersen in this. It's the Shepherdess and the Sweep. It's just very, very short. Oh yes, but it has got a weird thing in it, which is so there's a bit that's the Goat's Leg High Adjutant General Military Commandant, but that's all one word, and I'm not entirely sure why. Unless it's a joke. Oh, it is one word in Danish. Oh, that'll be why then. Yeah, who translated this? Let's have a look. That is pretty great. Oh, anonymously translated. Yeah, that's fair enough. Don't tell anyone that I've translated this really badly. Yeah, that's highly entertaining. I did wonder if it was something like that. Yeah, is Danish sort of like we're just going to throw all of the words together? Oh, it's famously one word. Oh, okay. Well, that explains it. I was saying to Sam just before this. I hope Sill's in chat because I'm going to do a Danish one here, and either I'm going to just completely murder it, or I can ask you for pronunciation. Because yeah, although there's not too many weird names in this. It's fine. It's just yeah, the slightly more difficult to pronounce languages like Icelandic and things like that have interesting names. Longest actually used. Oh my goodness me! And what does that mean? I wonder if I can guess. Special is plot. Oh, I don't know. The problem is I don't know where each word begins. I think, is it German that still has or lays claim to the longest word, which is like the star on the hat of the captain of the like Rhine paddle steamer company or something like that, down in the valley. Yeah. Yeah, I remember learning that. In German. Specialist doctor's offices planning stabilizations period. Okay. That still doesn't mean anything to me. Hang on. Right. Yep. That's a very specific word. For a very specific circumstance. Oh, and Dutch has similar things. Oh, Germanic languages are the best. It's like, what word are we going to have for this thing that's a bit like this? Well, just say that. It's a bit like this. Well, can't we give it a separate word? No. What's the point of that? Economy of language and all that. Although, then you look at how French count numbers. which still baffles me. Get to 80 and they just go off on their own thing. What are you, what? What? Okay. But yes, that's amazing. Long words is great. Oh, interesting. English systems as 420s and 10-9. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. They're actually separating words now. Huh. I mean, surely that's actually less efficient. Like shoving all the words together is actually pretty efficient. Damn English. Oh no. Please don't tell me Danish you've got weird numbers as well. Oh, why? You were doing so well. What does Danish do then? So, welcome to Language Talk, everyone. This is interesting. I'm learning things. 57 is 2 score and half of the third 7. Wow. Okay. Why? That. Yeah, because a score is 20, isn't it? I know. I thought a score was 80. Or at least it is for us. Or maybe score is 20. Yeah, maybe score is 20. So that would be 2 score if score is 20, so it'll be 40. Where does the half of the third 7 come in? I wish to understand the logic behind this. Like with French, it sort of makes sense. It's very silly, but it sort of makes sense. But half of the third 7? It's 2 scores, so 40. Okay, so score is 20. And half of... Oh, I see! You literally invented numbers to avoid... Yeah. Ah, yes. But then languages are just like, no, we're going to do our own thing. Oh, so it's half of the third score. That's very silly. Why? Why? That's... I mean, it's amazing. So is that... What's the silliest number then in Danish? Is that the silliest number in Danish? The feeling you get when you stub your toe on the edge of a wooden coffee table in the dark. And 3. 95 is literally half of the 5th score, 5. I mean... Why? Is it something about odd numbers? It's something about odd numbers, isn't it? Just And welcome back from the break. I hope you've all had a nice break discussing languages and breathing in words. But why? Why would you make your language actually physically difficult? That feels like shooting oneself in the foot a little bit. I thought two dimensions that gives, yeah, sounding really spooky. I imagine. It's just, is Denmark okay? Are you lot okay over there? You're just trying to make your lives more difficult? I mean, might be a way of just like going, yeah, we don't need to talk to children, do we? Just, blimey. Yeah. I guess welcome to Language Chat. And also, hi Lena. Welcome to Language Chat. Oh dear. Yeah. This all stemmed from a word in Hans Christian Andersen's The Shepherdess and the Sweep being ridiculously long in English, which doesn't make sense really, and Syl saying that it's all one word in Danish, so, and it's apparently a very famous word, so the translators obviously just kept it like that in the English for the lols. You can speak without pausing. Oh, okay, fair enough. Basically circular breathing, but with actual speaking. Which, yeah, efficient, I guess. Your aunt had to learn Danish from the start. Blimey. That sounds fun. See, now I want to learn it. It sounds like a challenge. Yeah. That's 20 years to become fluent if it's your second language. Blimey. See, here's me thinking that things like Korean, Japanese and Chinese and all other sort of derivatives are the most difficult languages to learn because there's so much that we with Western ears don't hear in terms of tone, like tonally, like tiny little shifts in tonality, and inflections and things like that we find it very difficult to pick up on. But yeah, well, today I learnt that Danish is also really bloody difficult. Oh dear. Yeah, that's yeah, sounds fun. And on that note, the next story is from Denmark. This, yeah, I will shout if there's anything in here that I can't pronounce. Hopefully there won't be anything. This is by Maya Aaron Goldschmidt, and it's a little story called Henrik and Rosalie. The fate that rules in matters of love is often singular, and its ways are inscrutable, not only in vital things but also in those of less importance, as this story will show. Henrik Falk, student of divinity, had taken his fiancée, Rosie Hedvigberg, to the theatre one evening to see Heiberg's The Inseparables. The following morning, as he was seated in his cosy student quarters at Regensen, smoking his pipe, he received the following note. I consider it best that our engagement be broken. Rosalie. Falk's surprise upon reading this message can easily be understood. He put down his pipe, dressed quickly, and hastened to his fiancée's home. There he was told that Rosalie had gone away, but if he wished he could see her aunt. The aunt arrived but could give him no explanation, as she herself was in the dark about the whole affair. When Rosalie had returned from the theatre the previous night, she had been very quiet, but soon after she had shown signs of great inward agitation and had said to her, that said to her the unpoetic relations which existed between Mull and Clyster, main characters in the play, seemed unbearable, even wrong, and that probably all, or at least the greater part of engaged couples were like that, or else sooner or later would assume that indifferent attitude toward each other, in which case she preferred to remain single. Whereupon she had written scores of letters, no doubt all to him, Henrik Falk, had again torn them up, one after the other, but had finally sent one letter to the post office. She did not go to bed, but packed her belongings and left by the morning train. "You know," continued Rosalie's aunt, "I had really no control over her plans. She was here only on a visit, and if she wanted to go to other relatives of hers, I had no means of preventing her." Which relatives, which uncle and aunt, for Rosalie's parents were dead, the lady would not tell. She said she had given her word of honour not to disclose the secret. They discussed the matter for some time, and in the course of the conversation Rosalie's aunt asked Henrik if he was certain that he had not in any way offended the young girl, of which he assured her most emphatically. "Oh well," said the aunt, "it is a difficult problem to handle such a young girl, only 17 years of age, besides being of independent means. You know, Mr. Falk, she was really too young to become engaged. Next time you must be more cautious." On his way home, and for several hours after, Henrik reviewed carefully his past life. He had to admit that there had been moments when he had not exactly regretted, but almost regretted his engagement. Not because he had found any fault whatsoever with Rosalie. In the light in which he now viewed the situation, he asked himself what it was that at times had made him less appreciative of his good fortune, in fact so ungrateful that it was now difficult for him to realize his former feeling. When he examined his own heart, he remembered that even the previous day it had almost seemed to him as if Rosalie had been won too easily. They met at a dance shortly after he had finished college. Later there was a casual meeting, a walk, a happy mood, and the word was said. He had been accepted, and fortune had bestowed upon him a happiness far greater than he had heretofore realized. Yes, that was the trouble. He had not appreciated his good luck. In his heart there had been an apathy, a lack of force and will, a want of enthusiasm which she undoubtedly had noticed, and now she had punished him cruelly but justly. In his present mood she appeared to him in all her loveliness, which for some time he had almost overlooked. He saw her before his mind's eye more clearly than he had ever beheld her with his physical eye. And now it was all over. For among the qualities which heretofore he had hardly noticed or appreciated in her, one trait now seemed to stand out. She was determined and high-minded. It was due to her ideality and womanly loftiness, and due to her lack of coquetry that she had immediately accepted him, and this romance he had dragged into mere prose and thereby become extremely unhappy himself. For some time he grieved very much, and although his sorrow became less intense as time passed, it remained in his heart and made a great change in him. To begin with, he gave up the study of theology. This desire had been as sudden as his engagement. He had discussed with Rosalie country life, parsonages, happiness, and before he knew it, this had led him to speak the decisive word. Later he had had a feeling that the way in which he had spoken contained a promise that he would lead her into his parsonage. This was the reason why he chose the study of theology. But now there was no reason why he should follow this profession. He had lost all desire either for parsonages or parsons' wives, or in fact for wives of any kind, and he decided to take up the study which he had originally preferred, and which in his present mood seemed to offer the greatest emancipation from his former plans, namely medicine. After 5.5 years of hard study, Henrik Falk had finished and was ready to start out as a young physician. He decided to settle down in some provincial town, and this was especially due to the fact that, in the course of time, he had developed a certain romantic sentiment. In Copenhagen, everything seemed to him so prosaic, while life in a small town, with visits to the neighbouring villages, still offered an opportunity of finding innocence, spontaneity, romance and poetry. He heard that there were prospects of acquiring a clientele in a small town in Jutland, and he immediately left for that place. But although the good-looking young doctor with the wistful smile made a pleasant impression, he immediately met with difficulties. There were not many apartments to be had, and the few that suited him, the landlords did not like to rent him for fear of offending his colleagues who were already established there. Just at that time, a veterinary died, and having some available funds, Falk bought the veterinary's house from his widow and soon moved into these new quarters. One day, not long afterwards, a man from the neighbouring country drove up in front of the house and asked the doctor to follow him to his master's farm. Falk was pleased that the news of his establishment had already reached the farmers in the district. His new, hitherto unused doctor's stool was soon placed in the waggon, and the two drove off in silence. After they got out of the town, Falk asked the sullen driver, "What is the matter with your patient? What do you think has gone wrong?" "He got a bone in his throat," replied the man. "I see. Did you not try to slap him on the back?" The man turned slowly toward the doctor, looked puzzled at him, and said, "Very likely." There the conversation ended, and after a while they arrived at the farm, which was situated at the edge, or almost at the edge of the heath. The farmer received the doctor, showed him the way to the parlour, and sent for sandwiches and brandy, but Falk had no appetite. As a matter of fact, he did not feel quite well. Finally, the time came to look at the patient, and Falk was somewhat surprised when the farmer led him into the yard, through the stables, and stopped at a small isolated house situated in a morass which sent out a most unpleasant odour. The farmer opened the low door and took the doctor over to a pig. "There he is," he said. Henry Falk had entirely forgotten that he had moved into the house of a veterinary. The blood rushed to his cheeks and he cried, "What? Do you expect me to cure your pig?" The farmer answered, "Well, before you came we sent for Jesperson to cure the horse, but next time, if it so pleases our lord, you shall treat the horse also. Today you will have to be satisfied with the pig." "Go to hell with your pig and your horse." "You should not use such ugly language," said the farmer, and coloured slightly. "That is just what I shall," shouted the doctor, "and next time you have a sick beast, send for a veterinary and not for a practising physician. I have heard it said that to you farmers nothing is too good for your beasts, but that you scarcely send for a veterinary when a human being is ill." "Is that so?" said the farmer. "Yes, that is so. And now let me get back to town immediately." "Go ahead," replied the farmer. "Nobody is holding you back. Neither you nor your foul words. You had better take them along with you." It just occurs to me," said the doctor in a milder tone, "that there may be a misunderstanding somewhere. I moved into the house of Hansen, the veterinary, so that may explain the case." "Maybe," answered the farmer. "Will you please send the waggon for me?" "No. Our horses shall not drive you or your ugly words from this place. Not unless you cure the pig first." "Don't talk to me about your confounded pig." Without another word, the farmer took hold of the doctor so it hurt, pressing the latter's arms tightly up against his sides just above the hips, and by lifting him a little from the ground, brought him into an almost horizontal position. In this fashion the farmer carried him outside, and not until they had reached some distance from the farm did he put him down, exclaiming, "Shame on you and your horrid language!" Groaning with pain and anger, the doctor cried, "You shall drive me home. You have my doctor's stool. If you keep it, you are a thief." The farmer returned to the house, fetched the stool, and, laying 2 kroner upon it, said, "There you are, and once more, shame on you!" the doctor realised that he had lost out. He decided to start his way home on foot, and in the meantime try to hire somebody to fetch his stool. Unfamiliar as he was with the neighbourhood, he only remembered that when entering the farm he had turned to the left, so that in leaving he now turned to the right. But he entirely overlooked the fact that he had been put out on the opposite side, and the result was that he took the wrong direction. At first, owing to his agitated condition, he did not notice the surroundings, but when after a while he began to wonder that he had not yet reached the main road, he could no longer find even the path. Nothing but wheel tracks could be seen in the heath. Besides, it was not only beginning to grow dark, but a cold rain had started and a sharp wind was blowing. He deliberated for a moment, trying to find his bearings, and as he considered carefully everything that had happened, he remembered suddenly that the farmer had not put him out by the front gate. He realised, therefore, that he had taken the wrong course and would have to go back almost as far as he had come. He did not want to pass the farm once more, and besides, he figured out that as the farm must have been on his right hand and the town south of the farmstead, he would have to keep in a straight line towards the southeast. But the heath cannot be traversed by means of guesswork, and after a short time he absolutely lost his way among the heather, wet to the skin and surrounded by utter darkness. The situation began indeed to seem perilous, and not without reason. The indisposition he had felt earlier in the day had increased. The blood hammered in his temples, and his head was hot and pained him considerably. His clothes were soaking wet, and he shivered with cold. He forced himself to go forward, walking in a straight line, and continued this course, not so much because he had hopes of finding his way, but in order to get warm and not to collapse. Suddenly the heath seemed to change into meadowland. He discovered in the distance a house with lights in the windows, but a body of water separated him from it. He continued his way, almost unconscious. At this moment, two women, one an elderly lady and the other a young girl of 22 or 3 years of age, were sitting in the spacious, old-fashioned parlour on the estate Lundtofte. The old lady looked wise and placid. The young girl had a soulful face which might have been considered fitting for the heroine of a romance on an isolated estate. She had a dreamy expression, and her whole appearance denoted a charming simplicity, but at the same time there was something indescribable about her person, about her eyes, her complexion, her hair, or perhaps the manner in which it was piled on her head, which did not belong in these surroundings, which seemed to conceal a memory and to rebel against the thought that the doors were closed, that no guest was expected, unknown though his name may be. To him who understood the language, this young figure expressed, not in plain letters, but in music without words, that she had approached many a guest with a searching glance, but had again withdrawn after consulting something within herself which always in the last moment seemed to admonish her to wait. The poetic nimbus that surrounded her was expectancy, expectation of some romance, a beginning, pensive doubt as to whether it would ever happen, and at the same time a firm determination to give romance a trial for another year, even if her cheeks should grow a little paler in the waiting. The head of the household was absent on a hunting party. He may not have been a very interesting man, but even a less entertaining person to whom one is accustomed may by his absence leave a hole, an emptiness which it is difficult to fill, especially in the country where the postman is not expected for another day or two, or where the farmhand has returned from his last trip to town with the wrong books from the circulating library, or perhaps with no books at all. Fortunately, Lundtofte had its own library. After impatiently putting aside her embroidery, the young girl fetched a copy of Oehlenschläger's poems, and at the request of the older lady began reading aloud. It was the romance about Aga and Elsa. Before she had reached the end, she suddenly stopped, exclaiming, I wonder how these legends arise about lovers who step forth from their graves. I am sure they are not taken from real life." The old lady's reply led the conversation to the subject of ghosts. And then with a jump it turned again to love, and once more drifted on to ghosts, until the young girl said it would be worthwhile meeting someone in this life who had the power and the will to appear to us after death. The old lady replied, "Those who would do that for us we probably do not see in the right light until they are in their graves." Then silence followed, in which each was occupied with her own thoughts. Suddenly the maid appeared and said, "Someone is outside asking for shelter." "What sort of person?" demanded the old lady. I don't know, he looks awful, as if he was steeped in his own clothes." "Is he a journeyman?" "No, he wears a white shirt, even though it is no longer white." "I wonder who it can be. Ask him his name." The maid left, but returned immediately, saying, "He is lying outside." "What do you mean?" "Yes, he is lying outside. I am afraid he is dead." They all hurried into the hall. The young girl uttered a cry at the sight of Henry Falk, for he it was, our wandering doctor, as my reader no doubt has guessed. The old lady gave instructions to get a room ready, to put warm sheets on the bed, and so forth. It took several days before the doctor regained consciousness, and when it happened, he experienced something which everyone in his own way may expect to encounter once in his life, namely, a miracle. Something so wonderful and exquisite that it does not seem to come to us from natural sources according to rules and merits, or even by accident, but must have befallen us by the grace of God. Rosalie was sitting at his bedside, lovelier than ever, beautified through her very sacrifice, fairy-like and glorified by the suddenness, the strangeness, and the enchantment of the whole occurrence. How these two again joined the bond that had been torn asunder more than 5 years ago, my reader must picture for himself. Such reconciliations are made in words which have a strange and mysterious power over those by whom they are expressed and those for whom they are intended, but to everyone else they lose their wondrous sound. It may be said, however, that the reconcilement was so much easier as Rosalie had never really thought that the connection had been broken entirely, and, strange as it may sound, when she wrote her little note to Henrik, she had a feeling, not as if the tie would cut forever, but rather as if it were being prolonged for an indefinite time. Let him who can explain it, though it is of no vital importance any more than the fact that it soon occurred to Henrik that he too had had the same feeling. However this may be, there was one thing which still lingered in Rosalie's memory after the first rapture, in which the whole estate participated, had subsided, and which never ceased to have an exhilarating and refreshing influence on her married life. It was the delight she took in picturing to herself Henrik traversing the heath, guided by her love, although ignorant thereof and even unwilling in his suffering condition. It seemed to her that she had seen with her own eyes life's poetry brought into reality, by his side, with her hand on his shoulder, leading him through the wet heather, forcing him forward step by step toward the happiness which had once been lost. These memories were forever a source of great happiness to her, and every time the subject was discussed, it brought to the doctor's face a tender and grateful smile, yet at the same time gave him an uncomfortable feeling which he carefully concealed, for he had not the heart to tell his wife in plain words that this wonderful, blessed, romantic turn in their lives was due to an unromantic pig who had got a bone in his throat. And that's the end of that one. That's a lovely one, I like that. And yes, I hope I vaguely pronounced things right. What was that first one? Hang on, let's find it again. Yes, there we go, that's the one. Hvidbjerg. Hvidbjerg. G. Right enough that I understood what you said most of the time. Good! Well, I mean, most of it was in English, so I'd be a bit worried if you didn't. Yeah, Hvidberg? Hvidbjerg? Yeah, that. I don't know. There was one more, I think. Bibbida. No, I've lost it. I think, was there another one? No, I think it was just that one. Oh, good. I'm glad it's difficult to pronounce. I'm glad I'm not just an idiot. Ween's White Mountain. Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's a really nice second name. Oh, right. H and the G are silent. So it's like Vidbjer? Vidbjer? Something like that? Am I vaguely right? Vidbjer. Okay, I will stop trying to butcher. Closer. Good! Hooray! Danish is weird. No. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a pronunciation lesson. So, yeah, so we've had Russian, a Russian short story, we've had a Danish short story, and now I'm going to utterly butcher a Norwegian short story. Yay! So if anyone in chat knows anything about Norwegian, sorry, in advance. We'll see how this goes, I guess. This will probably be the last one I do tonight, I think, because it's probably about the same length as the one I've just read. I'm doing great, thanks, Salad. I'm trying. See, I did A-level German, so sort of Germanic pronunciation I'm sort of okay with, but then when you stuff like other sort of, yeah, it's slightly different things like V's next to things that are silent and consonants that don't necessarily go together usually in German, so like in other languages my brain just goes, I don't know what to do there. So yeah, the joys of being English and just our awful way of teaching languages. But yes, let's have another one. This is a Norwegian tale by Johan, I'm assuming Bohier or Bogier, I don't know. And this is called, I think, Skobberleff. Skobberleff was a horse. This was in the days when the church bells of a Sunday morning sent out their summons, not over moribund highways and slumberous farmsteads, but over a parish waiting to be wakened into life by the sustained solemn calling of those brazen tongues. The bells rang till the welkin rang again. Come, come, old and young, rich man, poor man, dalesman, fisherman, man from the hills, the forest, the fields, the strand, the fells, Mads from Fallin, and Anders from Berg, and Ola from Rhine, and Mette from Naust, and Mari and Kari from Denstali, Lee, come, come, come. And so the roads grew black with people on their way to church, some walking and some riding. Old codgers wheezed past, stick in one hand, hat in the other, their coats under their arms, and their grey homespun trousers tucked into boots shiny with grease. The women trundled along carrying shawls and hymn books, and scenting the breeze with their perfumed handkerchiefs. Out on the lake, bordered with hills and farms, appeared rowboats driven over the water by sturdy oarsmen. From across the fjord swept the sailboats. Far up in the mountains it seemed as if even the cattle stopped grazing, and the boy who was watching them put the goat horn to his lips and blew a stout blast down towards the folks at home. In those times, Sunday was both holy day and holiday. Looking back after these many years, I have a vivid impression that all the world was sunshine and green forests on a day like that. The old church, brown with tar, standing amidst the crowns of mighty trees, seemed then to be more than just a building. There was something supernatural about it, as if it knew all there was to be known. Many hundreds of years had passed over it. It had seen the dead when they were still alive, when they went to church like ourselves. The surrounding graveyard was a little village of wooden crosses and stone slabs, and the grass grew wild between the leaning monuments. We knew well enough that the sexton mowed it and fed it to his cows, so that when we got a drink of milk at his house, we felt as if we were quaffing the very souls of the departed, a kind of angelic milk from which we drew transcendental virtues with every draught. We boys used to stand outside the church and do as our elders did, size up the people that arrived after us. We judged by appearances, and they all knew it. The dandies ran the gauntlet of both friendly and unfriendly eyes, and pretty women looked down and smiled. We youngsters searched the gathering throng for someone to admire, some heroic figure we should like to resemble when we ourselves one day should be grown up. There was the new teacher, for instance, stalking along in his homespun with his coat buttoned tight, with a white necktie, top hat and umbrella. He was at least one stage above the farmer. Not a doubt about it. We too were going to attend a normal school. So we thought, at any rate, until a butcher came up from the city, wearing a suit of blue duffel, a white waistcoat with a gold watch chain, cuffs, a dazzling white collar and a straw hat. He was a perfect revelation. With such an exemplar before us, it was easy to decide that we were to become butchers' apprentices as soon as we were old enough. Many were the magnates that paraded through our daydreams. Still, it was with no ordinary emotion that we laid eyes for the first time on a city lawyer. His was a truly royal presence. Even his nose had its appropriate ornament, a pair of gold eyeglasses. Our ambitions soared beyond all bounds. Whatever our hopes of higher education might be, most of us were bent on carrying our studies far enough to impair our vision and to so justify the use of gold-rimmed glasses. Then came Skobelev, and Skobelev was a horse. For weeks, busy little feet had been bringing the tidings to all corners of the parish. Peter Lowe had bought a registered stallion that was not simply a horse, but a whole Arabian Nights entertainment. It took 6 men to lead him ashore from the steamer. Only one man could have turned the trick alone, and that was Peter Lowe himself. For the most part, the horse walked on his hind legs. He kept whinnying even in his sleep. He was so fierce that he had already killed a number of men. His name was Skobelev. And what do you suppose they fed him? It was neither hay, nor oats, nor bran, not much. Skobelev's fodder was nothing less than eggnog, made with whiskey at that. It was common talk that Peter Lowe and the stallion munched this provender together out of the same crib. They required stimulants, the two of them. To return to that particular Sunday, we were standing at the church, keeping an impatient lookout across the parish. Peter Lowe was bound for the house of worship, driving none other than Skobelev himself. The long line of vehicles came rolling in from the valleys. It picked up reinforcements at every crossroad until it was like a regular bridal procession. That day we kept our eyes on the horses and estimated the people in the gigs according to their dumb-driven cattle. A whole fated universe passed in review, animals fat and lean, jaded and fiery, old big-bellied nags with long necks and prominent backbones, and heads sagging with each step towards the ground under the burden of unceasing tribulation, prosperous-looking brutes that gave manifest proof of good crops and bank deposits. "Look at that brood mare. She has weaned many a colt and therefore carries her head high and surveys the world with maternal eyes." Here and there you can pick out fjord ponies with ragged haunches, stamping against the grade and sweating with the weight of the heavy gig, some of them so small that they make you think of mice. There comes a big old bay with huge watery eyes and quivering knees, looking about as if to ask why there is no Sabbath for the likes of him. Don't miss the physiognomies of these virtuous, censorious fillies proclaiming the vanity of vanities, and just behind them, wild young gallants neighing at the world in general. Have a look at that bay gelding. Why is his belly all splattered with mud? That's easy. He is from a mountain farm. Early this morning he had to wade through heath and marsh, across brooks and rivers on the way to the parish below, where his master could borrow a cart. He has another tough time coming before he gets home. Talk about long processions! But what has become of Peter Lowe? Where is Skobeleff? At last there comes someone driving behind all the others. He is still far away, beyond the farmhouses. Never mind, he is gaining ground at a pretty smart pace. Hundreds of eyes are fixed in rapt attention. The church bells rang out. Most of the horses had been unhitched and were tied to the big ash trees. There they stood with their heads buried in bags of hay, grinding at their dinners and gazing absently about. All of a sudden they jerked their heads up, and even the most raw-boned skates made shift to arch their necks as they stared down the road. Enter Peter Lowe. Enter Skobeleff. He came trotting along before the gig, a broad black hulk, his fetlocks dancing, his mane sweeping in billows down his neck, his eyes shooting fire, 2 red prize ribbons waving at his ears. He raised his head and snuffed the breeze, monarch of all he surveyed. Then he lifted up his voice and split the welkin. Believe me, that was a trumpet call that fetched the echoes out of the mountains. In the gig sat Peter Lowe, holding the reins relaxed, a very debonair man, not over 35, broad of shoulder, vigorous, smiling out of a corner of his mouth above his chin whiskers. It was certainly too bad that his wife, sitting beside him, was so much older than he. Her every feature drooped, her red cheeks drooped, her eyes drooped, the corners of her mouth drooped. She always spoke in whimpering tones. As for Peter Lowe himself, he had a weakness for all things pretty, even for such as were not his own. As Skobeleff neighed to his affinities, Peter Lowe glanced at good friends of his own among the crowd and smiled. Skobeleff came to a stop, but got a cut of the whip. He reared and got another stroke. Then he bounded up the road towards the parsonage, the crowd in his wake, we boys flying ahead like birds on the wing. It was a circus to watch Peter Lowe manoeuvre Skobeleff out from the shafts of the gig and over towards the stable door. Peter Lowe for sure looked swell that day. The horse must have lent him a new dignity. His grey suit was so well brushed, and he wore a stiff hat, just like the teacher's. But every now and then his polished boots flew up in the air. The crowd stared for all they were worth. Too soon the magic horse disappeared behind the stable door. Peter Lowe came out again, brushing the horsehairs from his hands. He picked his way carefully so as not to soil those shiny boots as he walked down to the church. The crowd trekked after him. Peter Lowe mounted the steps to the hall and walked in. The congregation followed at his heels. Peter Lowe sat down in one of the pews, opened a hymn book, and began to sing. The congregation did likewise, and the singing rose in volume. But on this particular day we youngsters kept watch and ward outside the stable door. It was a mighty good thing it was locked. There was no telling what Skobeleff would do if he got loose on his own account. The cold chills ran down our spines as we heard him rattling his halter and stamping on the floor. Now and again the walls shook with his neighing. Talk about thrills! We stood still, put our heads together, and spoke in whispers. It was a great day for the horses, too. The mares under the ash trees lost their appetites and stood all the while arching their necks and trying to look like 2-year-olds. Stallions and geldings had that day caught sight of a rival whose eyes flashed with arrogance. Do you suppose they would put up with that sort of thing? They pawed the ground furiously and shook the air with protests from all sides. At last the bells rang again. The congregation came out, but the greater number had no thought of hitching up their own horses. The yard was jammed with people wanting to see Peter Lowe lead Skobelev out of the stable. The man himself approached, the eyes of all waiting on him. He strolled along, talking to the sexton as if he were an ordinary mortal. Yet he had already acquired certain of the gestures that the parson was accustomed to make use of in the pulpit. The people gradually drew back from the road. One circumspect man dragged his gig away from the middle of the yard. The women took refuge on the landings of the barns. It was just as well to be on the safe side, but everybody wanted to see what was going on. Peter Lowe unlocked the stable door and disappeared from view. A sevenfold thunder of neighing sounded from within. The halter rattled, heavy hoofs drummed against the floor, and the next minute a black barrel of a body appeared on the threshold. Skobelev flung his battle cry to the four winds. Peter Lowe was hurled aloft, but landed on his feet some distance out in the yard. Women shrieked, old men jumped out of the way, hats flying right and left. Peter Lowe and Skobelev started to dance around the yard. Skobelev snorted and foamed so that his dark body was dappled with froth. He had no mind to be led toward the gig. He reared, pummeled the air with his hooves, and plunged from side to side, while a pair of shining boots kept cutting strange capers through space. It was an apocalyptic vision, something to dream about. The yard was swept clean of vehicles and people in a trice. It had been changed into a ballroom for Peter Lowe and Skobelev. Peter Lowe yelled at the stallion, and the stallion screamed at the universe and at Peter Lowe. On went the dance. Finally, Skobelev seemed bound to enter the parsonage and have a chat with the preacher's wife, but Peter Lowe got ahead of him and planted his splendid boots with a resounding thump against the steps, so that Skobelev succeeded only in tearing down the railing. Peter Lowe grew red in the face. Skobelev's whole body had become a mass of foam. The women gasped out shivering sighs. At last the wild beast was forced between the shafts. As the reins were loosened, he rose on his hind legs, and the lash fell on his neck. He pranced about on all fours with arched neck and flaring nostrils. Then Peter Lowe's wife came up, gathering her shawl around her shoulders, and, believe it or not, stepped calmly into the gig while the earthquake was still going on. Now Peter Lowe knew that the victory was his. He put his hand on the dashboard and leaped up beside his wife. The horse reared, his eyes shot fire, the foam flew, the whip cracked, and the next second the whole show dissolved in a cloud of dust rushing along beyond the farmhouses. We stood rooted to the spot. The other men began bashfully to hitch up their own horses. There was really nothing at all left to look at. From that day, Skobelev was an influential personality throughout the parish. To tell the truth, Peter Lowe and Skobelev took on together a sort of higher individuality that drew the popular gaze as they flashed by. It seemed as if they were whipping the whole neighbourhood up to a more rapid tempo. The farmers came to be men of honour so far as their horses were concerned, fed them well and groomed them with the utmost care. They drove at a brisker pace along the roads. Their speech acquired an added dash of humour. They laughed in the face of heaven and earth. Their thoughts assumed a new boldness. On Sundays, as the congregation stood outside the church admiring Skobelev and Peter Lowe, a fresh source of vitality seemed to be manifesting itself. Men saw with their own eyes the very embodiment of animal spirits. They sensed something venerable in brute strength. They caught the chanted praise of rippling muscles. It began to dawn on them that life is not a mere medley of sins and sorrows, that life on earth has a glory of its own. As time passed, Peter Lowe gave increasing attention to his clothes. He took to reading books, to wearing a white collar, to using a handkerchief when he blew his nose about the precincts of the church. He imitated the sheriff's mannerisms of speech. He knew quite well that he and Skobeleff had become the local Synosas, and this persuasion lent him a feeling of responsibility and a desire to serve as a pattern for the herd. If the truth must be told, it was not only we boys who prayed, "Good Lord, help us to be like Peterlo when we get big." By no means. The grown-ups too tried to ape his manner. "You are brushing your shoes just the way Peterlo does," one man would say to another. "And you are wearing a white collar just like Peterlo's," they would say. Skobeleff, imported to ennoble the rural breed of horseflesh, had become a spiritual force, an educational institution for the entire countryside. Peterlo was not quite so fortunate. He could not be happy except in the society of the stallion. He lost interest in work. He was in his element only when racing down the country roads behind his crony, or when he and Skobeleff together conducted revival services beneath the very walls of the church. The rumour spread that he had taken to sleeping in the stable. Gossip would have it that horse and man were coming to resemble each other. Skobeleff smiled out of the corner of his mouth when he met with his affinities, and Peterlo greeted good friends at church with something like a whinny in his voice. Peterlo's lot was not altogether enviable. He had a fondness for all things pretty, not excepting those that belonged to his neighbours. And when he got into an unusually bad scrape, he made a most pathetic figure. Then he would go to church and take communion. Many a time we saw him come driving, not the wild stallion, but an old mare. His sour-visaged wife, wrapped in her shawl, would be sitting in the cart, at one side of which walked the sexton, and at the other side Peterlo with bowed head. On such a day he would have his mind made up to listen to the sermon with folded hands, and not once to glance in the direction of the women's pews. Afterward he would step forward to the altar and partake of the sacrament. These penitential pilgrimages occasioned more than one good laugh. "Peter has had a very sorry adventure again," people would say. A day or two later you would see him tearing down the highway with Skobeleff. So he kept on laying up scores of gaiety and aesthetic appreciation of the beautiful until his conduct became more reprehensible than ever. His wife insisted upon Skobeleff's deportation from the farm. It was impossible to convert Peter to virtuous ways so long as he maintained a companionship of that sort. Meanwhile, round about in the parish there grew up a numerous race of black prancing horses, and the wheels rumbled faster on all the roads. A whinnying joy of life took sovereign possession of the community. Men lifted up their heads and cast jovial eyes on their surroundings. Women plucked up courage actually to laugh out loud, and young folks discovered anew the pleasures of the dance. But Skobeleff was not to reach old age. He broke out of the stable one night and ran off in the mountains to find his affinities, who were accustomed to graze there during the summer. When Peterlo came along and saw the empty stable, he started shouting clamorous complaints. He evidently suspected at once that misfortune had stamped her mark upon his brow. He had a pretty shrewd idea where his comrade had fled, and witnesses reported that the whole day long they heard Peterlo tramping over the hills, neighing, just like Skobeleff, calling and coaxing his old chum. At last he found him. Skobeleff was standing up to his neck in a marsh, far off in the foothills. He had fought so hard to extricate himself that he had broken one of his forelegs, out of which protruded splinters of bone. The flies had stung his eyes until they bled. Peter wiped his pal's eyes with a tuft of grass and gave him a raw egg and a shot of whisky. For a little while he let his own tears roll, but finally there was nothing to do but to draw his knife. After that day, Peterlo drove more slowly along the roads. His head bent lower, and his whiskers turned grey. Now he is an old man, but he still dresses better than most of his neighbours, and affects a city brogue as before. When someone reminds him of Skobeleff, his eyes grow dim. Yes, he replied. Skobelev was not like other horses. He was a regular high school. He taught us all a thing or two. The end.